Thank you very much, Nomi, and may I say thank you to everybody who's given of their time to go through this feedback on this very important and fantastic project. It's a huge regional issue, and as mentioned by both the presidency and the Premier's office, it's the split jurisdiction has made it very difficult to cope with over the years, and we're hoping now to be in a position to really work right across all of those issues and deal with the thing in making this very important contribution. I will just switch off my video and then share. And if what I'll be doing is I'll give an overview, as Nomi said, and then I will hand over to Brian, who will talk on environmental issues at a broad scale. And then, depending on the time arrangements, we can come back to the tourism issue. Are we okay that we're seeing the video, the picture on the screen and my cursor moving there?
Yes, okay.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, then I'll start with that. Thank you very much. So, as was mentioned, we have this very, very big overall study area. Of course, it pales into insignificance when one looks at the size of the Magaliesberg biosphere, for example, but nevertheless, it's a very substantial thing. And the idea is absolutely not to see this as an opportunity for further urban sprawl. There's a requirement to do a very, very publicly led consolidation of a smart city, which implies all kinds of things around sustainability. But as mentioned, the thing that bedevils it in many respects is that's the portion of the study area that is part of City of Johannesburg. That's a portion that's part of Magalies City. And this northern portion is part of City of Tshwane. On top of that, we've got a provincial boundary involved between Northwest Province and Gauteng, and that gives us an adjoining local authority in the form of Madibeng that sits over there. Right, so that's fundamentally what we're having to deal with. Geotechnically, all of the area in red and orange is typically underlain with granite, whereas the area in Tshwane up in grey over here is quite typically dolomite, and that dolomite girdle in fact sits right around this broader area here. But fundamentally our area doesn't encroach into the dolomites other than in this northern Tshwane area over here. That study area was defined effectively as a 25-minute drive from Lanseria Airport in any given direction. So it's a very broad region, but we're having to make sense of it regionally and work down to this new smart city within that. That's the study area relative to the Magaliesberg biosphere. And so we sit really right on an edge portion of it. The Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site impinges slightly into our area, but from this point of view, the majority of the area we're sitting in here sits either in the transition zone or a buffer zone of the biosphere. What's quite interesting about this is that the work we're doing potentially morphs into a much bigger RSDF, a regional spatial development framework that might become trans-border with Northwest Province. So if we look at all the spatial development frameworks of Tshwane, of Johannesburg, of Magalies City, and then Madibeng, stretching right up here, there's Hartbeespoort Dam, just there where I'm pointing now. That's our study area in pink over there. It seems potentially so that we'd be able to extend an RSDF area to incorporate that lower part of Madibeng, for example. That would create a very different and bigger understanding of the region. If we had to look at that in detail, there's our study area now. If we add that southern part of Madibeng's spatial development framework onto that, it seems to us that if we just, for example, had to use the Magaliesberg range through there as a very clear and physical boundary and incorporate that, that would give us an area like that that would form part, and then that might become a regional spatial development framework boundary. All of that is a possibility at this stage, but very importantly, what that's giving us is to say, if that was to be thought of in that way as an extension of our study area in future, in a separate process going forward beyond our work, then that would potentially be the way of understanding the majority of this region against the backdrop of the Magalies biosphere, which of course then also incorporates the Crocodile River Reserve within all of that, but more of that later. So that just sets a broad context to this. If we look at the Gauteng City region as the context in which we are doing our urban work in all of this, you'll see that's roughly the extent of our study area diagrammatically here, where obviously we've got Johannesburg city centre there, we've got Tshwane city centre there, Magalies City or Old Krugersdorp in this area here. This is Northgate sits just in our study area there. This is Cosmo City, Lion Park, Diepsloot kind of area, and there of course is Lanseria Airport sitting in there, Cradle of Humankind nominally sitting there. Part of the importance of our work and why it's selected to do this here is because this is a portion of the greater Gauteng City region, which is scheduled to grow to 30 million people over the next 30 to 40 years. But there is a fair amount of marginalized community out on this fringe of the city, and of course, there's a large extent is a legacy of all kinds of issues, not least of which is the apartheid city kind of legacy. And in a sense, what we're looking to do is to try and make sense of that spatial nonsense. And so, how do we insert a smart city into this region in a way that makes sense of this urban periphery that we have at the moment? And so that is what we're looking to do, but we're looking to do it in such a way that it recognizes very carefully this vast biosphere that sits beyond the work that we're sitting in, and we're very mindful of the way in which we need to understand and work into that context. If we look at the city region itself, we take our clues from obviously Johannesburg city centre, Tshwane city centre, Magalies City, and as ever, that vast Randstad that's developed between Johannesburg CBD and Tshwane, with the predicated on Midrand at the middle there, the traditional old West Rand axis or corridor that runs out from Johannesburg city centre to Magalies City. And then what we have is this very high capacity freeway, the N14, that links from Magalies City to Tshwane, and we've got the Malibongwe Drive connection out across that, which then morphs into from Lanseria Airport as Pelindaba Road, that links out in various ways past the dam to Brits and Rustenburg. And of course that is the, in a sense, the gateway into the whole Magalies biosphere. And it's at that intersection of Malibongwe with the N14 that we look to make this intervention of a new smart city just south of the airport. So sitting in the pub with your mate, explaining this to them on the back of a cigarette box, the idea is to say there's Malibongwe Drive from Johannesburg to the dam. This is the N14 forming this radial route around the perimeter of the city region. And there's Lanseria Airport, which in many respects is the sole and most powerful economic driver of this whole particular area. Over the years, of course, there's been an evolving corridor of growth along Malibongwe Drive. It hasn't gone out as far as Lanseria Airport yet. There's a lot of baggy, unfilled in area, but of course there's a fair amount of this marginalized sprawl that has occurred out in this area over here. We are grateful for the constraint that's imposed by these natural elements that limit urban expansion, and we are grateful for things like the Renosterspruit, etc., and all of that that holds an extension there. And then understanding, as I've said before, the very important fact that we're transitioning into this Magaliesberg biosphere, and how do we work within this carefully. And so we're looking to take advantage of this evolving corridor, at least out towards Lanseria, and how to intersect that with the N14 in such a way that we put new infrastructure in place in that zone as a kind of a stitching mechanism, almost a development lattice that we want to lay over this, that allows us to attract new economic drivers. And this isn't about being led by housing, it's about finding new economic prospects in this area that drive then the sensible consolidation of a smart city that actually ties together all these disparate pieces now. And so the concentration is a very tight one. The last thing we want to be doing is sprawling the city, and we certainly don't want to give anybody else excuse to be sprawling the city. Of course, though, what we have at the moment, because of the many different jurisdictions here, we've got a patchwork of spatial development frameworks that don't really have much mutual intelligibility. Each one's been done in its own right, and so we get a lack of coherence in the land use management ideas across all these different jurisdictions. And part of our job and working at this broad regional scale is to unpack a big sensible picture in which the smart city then finds a particular role. So there's the area roughly in its much bigger context, a context that even is bigger than the Magalies biosphere. And the only real major piece of infrastructure there, of course, is the N14, and to a lesser extent Malibongwe and Pelindaba Road. There's not a great deal. In fact, it's an area that's poorly invested in from an infrastructural point of view, and that shows in the way the city's developed. This portion around Tshwane, the Joburg, the Greater Johannesburg area, and of course the Vaal Triangle area down here. You can see that Lanseria actually sits more or less in a kind of a development vacuum of this whole city region. We know, as you all do, that we've got very real housing issues in this region, as we have all over the show in trying to make sense of this future Gauteng city region. Some of these are big megacity projects from human settlements. Others are upgrades of informal settlements. Some of the informal settlements have expanded, and of course over here we've got a settlement, the Joe Slovo Muldersdrift area, just north of Lanseria Airport over there. And this region, though, has been one of the areas heavily identified by human settlements in the search for priority housing delivery land. And so the areas you see here have been identified, including this area to the north and west of the airport over there. We're certainly not keen on this idea of pushing more and more housing further and further beyond the city limits in here. We believe there should be a consolidation moving backwards into this sort of area and tying into where the city is already developed to varying degrees, and also sweating, of course, what infrastructure does sit in that area as well. You will be aware that way back over the last 15 to 20 years, there have been big initiatives around the idea of Cradle City and the Lanseria Airport City, all kinds of big ideas. And the net result is that over the years, people have been taking position and assembling large holdings of land. The big red one you see here is somewhat misleading because it catches the eye very strongly, but that's effectively the Northern Farms area, which is fed from the wastewater treatment works out to the north here. The intention is that's at capacity, incidentally. So this is really more of an agri issue. A new water treatment works over here, which more and more we're starting to think of as a water resource center, because that's the importance of water treatment works, is how do you get water back out of that and recycle and use all that resource and harvest that. There's also a view of a similar facility at Lindley over here, and there's been talk potentially of a big regional joint one somewhere in this area as well. But at the moment, this looks to be the likely one, and we are able to, with these things coming online over the next 5 to 10 year horizon, we're able to start thinking seriously now about how to use properly guaranteed, properly specified, and properly managed package plant treatments for sanitation, and to allow development to get going sooner rather than later. That's the single thing that's been holding up the majority of development potential in this area. There are, over the years, various applications that have been made for townships, and that's a scatter of them that you see there. This is the N14 through there. That's Molibongwe Drive running out. That's the airport, obviously sitting in that position there. We're still in the process of collating a lot of this information and getting it in place. The other big informant for us is the Gauteng strategic road network. As you can see, there's huge amounts of road planned in the area, but of course very little of it built. And our intent here is not to simply start rushing out and building a whole lot of road systems. We're really looking to try and catalyze development. So if that's where we've got Lanseria Airport over there, this is Malibongwe becoming Pelindaba Road, there's the N14 in blue cutting through there. The idea would be probably an upgrade of Malibongwe Drive in a way that right from day one we try and get a public transport facility into that, whether it's a rear via or whether it's initially only a high occupancy vehicle lane for taxis. It might even be in the longer term it morphs into a light rail system. All of that is possible, but we do of course have the fallback position of the PWV3 freeway indicated there, and of course that freeway is intended to run in fact all the way out and cut across the Magaliesberg or the Dusput and Timeball series to link to Rustenburg over time. We're not pushing that as part of our project. We're saying that if and when it's necessary because of a capacity point of view to have something like that, that can fit into our planning and we take that on board. But we're not seeing it as a priority driver. What we do see as a priority driver, if we could get this right, is that this is the Gautrain portion that's already built with Sandton Station as that dot over there. And it's desperately important for us to try and deliver public transport into this study area as soon as possible. Phase one of the Gautrain's expansion is from Sandton via Randburg up to Little Falls over here. But there's a spur off that phase one, that's part of phase one, that brings a spur up to Cosmo City. And that, of course, gives us a lot of penetration in the southern part of our study area. But our first prize, of course, is to try and see sooner rather than later to get this thing to project through to Lanseria. Now, that is only seen as phase 5 of this expansion from Gautrain's point of view. From our point of view, we're saying we want to do this sooner rather than later. Gautrain have said, well, it's all a matter of bums on seats. If you can get ridership out here, we'll bring that forward as soon as you can give us ridership. We're looking at it the other way, saying there's an extraordinary thing of how Gautrain has helped shape and grow the city. It is city building infrastructure. We would really hope that as a provincial initiative, it would be used to try and be a catalyst for this new smart city, and we could deliver that sooner rather than later and try and bring that into as close to a phase one kind of injection into the area, such that we can get another station in at the epicenter of where we see the real smart city, basically adjacent to the N14 and the intersection of Malibongwe, and that's where we believe a Gautrain injection would achieve two things. First of all, it would give us an immediate link between Lanseria Airport and OR Tambo Airport, which is strategically very important, and it would allow us to grow our new city much, much faster in this region over here. So if we're looking at our area, this is more or less where we would see the urban consolidation, an urban corridor running along the N14, and consolidation in and around those empty places between Stain City and the N14, and consolidating in and around the airport to morph into the corridor. So that really becomes the area of looking at consolidated urban development right on the threshold of and on this outer fringe of the Gauteng city region, such that the majority of our study area actually stays in this very useful thing of environment, tourism, heritage, all kinds of reserves and aquifers, and of course vast recreational capacity right on the doorstep of this mega city of 30 million people going forward, as well as the fact that right on that, and together with this much bigger understanding of the Magaliesberg biosphere, the Crocodile River Reserve, all of that forming a much bigger understanding, but equally in all of this getting some breadbasket that sits right on the edge of this vastly big market, and that of course brings us to this idea of how do we consolidate as tightly as possible so that we're not simply sprawling. And of course in all of this there's an injunction for the sustainable city. And so what are the underpinnings of sustainable urbanism? A lot of people just think of this as a big green initiative. A lot of people think it's about throwing a lot of tech-savvy digital stuff at it and making it a smart city. It's both of those things, of course, but it's much more than that as well. And so fundamentally, it's about a compact city with emphasis on convenient walking distances. It's a walkable city. It's also not only compact in its spatial extent, but it's complex in its activity patterns. There's no question of saying you'll live here and work way over there. You've got to be able to live, work, pray, and play in this mixed-use, intense, dense part of the city, an honest addition to the city structure. And very importantly, and this is one of the most fundamental things about urban sustainability, is it's got to integrate socially. How do you get the city to be spatially inclusive and democratic? It's one of the huge injunctions for South African planning, of course. That's what will define it as the post-apartheid city. And in all of that, we also need to allow those local economies to grow in such a way that we get a dual logic rather than these huge centralist kind of things. So one talks of, for example, how private enterprise very quickly spawns something like a Sandton or a Melrose Arch or a Waterfall City. But in many respects, what you're doing is you're spawning cities hugely successful in all kinds of economic ways, but they're not cities in an egalitarian, inclusionary way. In many cases, of course, they're quite exclusionary, and hence the need for this publicly led thing that will, of course, create the enablement for the private sector to come in and become, if you like, the city of 1,000 designers working around the capital web of the public environment that we've put in place and the infrastructural environment that we've put in place. And we know that fundamental to that infrastructure, as we've already spoken, is the need for public transport. We're not going to go very far with the private car now as the sole way of mobility. We've got to get, and it's going to go well beyond taxis as well, we've got to get much smarter with our public transportation. And we've got to, of course, more fundamentally than anything else, through the live, work and play model, we do away with the need to commute. You effectively want non-motorized transport of walking or cycling to be the default, and if you need to go further afield than that, there's a public transport system in place for that. Of course, all of this has to be underpinned and underlaid by the incorporation of a robust ecology and biodiversity, and that's fundamental to it. And then you can start talking about energy efficiency and how you get those efficiencies through the spatial patterning of this new city, and of course all the other things that we are looking at as well in terms of waste to energy, biogas, pyrolysis, all those kinds of things, as well as of course a solar capture. And smart cities with smart infrastructure and the digital tech savvy layer to it all, and understanding that fundamentally cities are about consumption. How do we do that sensibly and reducing the footprint of things? And we look at the next generation logistics hubs as it applies both to Lanseria as an air platform, but potentially how we look at the highway and even possibly some sort of rail connection for freight and logistics as well. And looking at infrastructure not as this vast amount of money thrown at things waiting for a city to grow in future, but managing select investments into infrastructure to keep us abreast with thresholds that we manage our risks around. And then very importantly, that agriculture is not something that happens over the hill and far away in some rural area. It is fundamentally a part of the urban economy, and we want that to be integrated very strongly into this. In many respects, a lot of this, Eddie Trout, who's one of the planners on our team, has been looking very heavily at the model of, if you think of the Western Cape with its very heavy reliance on that economy that comes out of agriculture, this extraordinary scenery, the extraordinary tourism, the extraordinary heritage, that really is an entire region. And how do you develop in and around that in such a way that you don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg and creates livability at a much bigger and more profound level? And so this idea of how urban agriculture embeds into that is one of the very, very interesting sections of the study. That's where we see the city centre being placed, basically at the intersection of Malibongwe Drive across the N14, favouring the N14 with the airport then sitting some way to the north of it over here. And of course, development around the airport and this new city over time will grow together to become one collective entity. And all of that, as Lebang said earlier, comes out of earlier work that laid the policy basis for that in the form of the Lanseria regional spatial development policy. And that is, it's a polynucleated urban node system linked very strongly with urban corridors and activity spines to create an urban structure that is sustainable and that minimizes the footprint of development in favor of a lot more of the bigger green background to all of this. And so that's an area that we would focus in on initially, as you see there. And if we look at that, that's pretty much how we're seeing the development framework and how it ties into the bigger planning of the road systems that are mostly back down towards City of Johannesburg and Magaliesburg City, rather than expanding northwards into the Magaliesburg area. And with that as the basis of our land use planning, we are able to schedule, and as Lebang said there, it's even at this scale, and trying to intensify. It's not hard to add 15,000 hectares of new urban space into this fringe. What we're very nervous about is not to give the idea that now it's open season on sprawling. We're not going to use that land until we run through the disciplines of urban structure, intensity, compact, complexity. And in that way, we talk about a transformed urban system which reinvents itself against reindustrialization of green and blue economy industries. It's adaptive, it's resilient, it's about future-proofing. And very importantly, it's also about modernizing to index ourselves against best practice internationally as we go forward into this very big urban future. And so even on that basis, with all these mixed use things all the way along these very big areas and floor areas that come out of that, it's not hard to achieve 850,000 new housing units, which at roughly 4 people per unit is going to be talking about 3 to 3.5 million people in this concentrated way along the N14 and in that node at Lanseria. There is the overall area, and largely it's about what you see as the development framework consolidating in this area here, with an urban corridor going down the N14 towards Mahali City, and then of course a northeastern extension of that corridor towards Tshwane. And that, we believe, sets us up for a basis on which we talk about the northern farms as being a kind of an agri-hub. That it's certainly not everything about the agriculture, but we do want to do something very important with that because of the availability of water and all kinds of other reuse. And this thing of exploring agri-villages, agri-tech, agri-processing, all of those things that are vital to this economy in this area, such that effectively a big portion of the study area remains fundamentally about green productivity, whether that's heritage, tourism, agriculture, or simply nature. And that, of course, as we've said, being part of a much bigger biosphere. So there's where we see the city centre growing around that interchange. And we conceptually want to achieve a future for Lanseria Airport so that it can grow, potentially even with the second runway that they've been talking about, although that may be in the very, very long-term future. We see our urban hub sitting down here closer to the N14. We, of course, take on board all the wetlands and river systems through that become part of the open space system of all of this. We see an institutional hub over here of convention centres, new international world trade centres, etc. And then, of course, a very strong focus on commercial freight and logistics, tying those entities together in a way that selective growth north of the airport does take place, probably more as an extension of the airport's kind of economy rather than just more urban sprawl. So if we look down towards the area where we're seeing the city centre, everything's predicated on that ergonomic of the 5-minute walk to make the walkable city. 400 meters, 5 minutes, 800 meters, 10 minutes. And that's how that layout is suggested at the moment. The open space system is embedded in it and takes all its clues from that open space system. The non-motorized transit routes are those dotted areas that make it either shuttle or walkable or cyclable. The road network, of course, lays the development lattice on which the private sector invests. We get key activity zones of an urban node down here, an institutional node up here, and growing up towards the airport. And all of that then giving us a new town centre that consolidates development, as you see there. The road network is pretty much filling into what's already there in the form of Malibongwe and the N14. We want to sweat as much of the interchange capacity off that if possible. And we see Gautrain running into this, such that we get a station at our urban core over there, and another one at the airport itself over there. And then the network of bus systems that spreads out over time to form a comprehensive network like that, many of which then have this potential to deliver light rail, possibly in whatever loop. All of this master planning doesn't drill down to that level of detail, but this idea of an integrated transport system where you can get off one system onto the other, of course, all living for that day that we can actually have smart cards that take us off one system onto another, is fundamentally what it's about. And that then gives us the basic diagram in which we get our urban core, we get our institutional core linking up towards the airport, we get secondary urban expansion in and around that core, and we get growth to a lesser extent up to the north of the airport in that zone between the airport and Monaghan Farm. And then with Stain City and Cosmo City, it then makes sense for us to consolidate along the highway down to Mogale City and northeasterly across to Tshwane with those urban corridors, which sets up the framework then for long-term consolidation of that without having to sprawl. And in fact, the thing that keeps us in check is being mindful of this, what I refer to as this great green yoke that weighs down on this and holds it all in check, so that we get the antithesis of sprawl. We actually get consolidation of the urban environment. And so that's, I think, where we could leave that for Brian to pick up on with his stuff, and then time permitting, we can come back and look at some tourism issues.
Thank you very much, Erky, for that excellent presentation. If we can then pass over to Brian. Brian?
Hi, yes, good afternoon, and afternoon to everybody. I'm Brian Gardner from Seaton Thompson and Associates, also known as Seaton Environmental. We've been part of the project looking at all the, well, at this point in time, it's the environmental status quo of the particular project. So I'll take you through a brief presentation on the environment and heritage sort of status quo as we have it in the Greater Lanseria Master Plan area at the moment. I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail on the actual policies and legislation that led us through this environment and heritage process. It would just be too long for this type of session to go into detail on all those policies and legislation. So I'm going to touch over it and just briefly discuss sort of what was considered in this particular study. So
Brian, sorry, Brian, before you go on,
yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I am picking up a bit of feedback, so I'm going to ask everyone to please mute, except Brian. Thank you very much. All right, go on, Brian. Sorry.
Thanks, no problem. I just wanted to, I see Erky still sharing his screen. Erky, could I ask if you can unshare so that I could share, please? Thanks.
Is that all right, Brian? Am I unshared now? I think so.
Yes, you are.
Yes, I think so, Erky. Thanks very much. I'm just okay. Sorry, it seems to be a little bit slow, but it's getting there.
We see that. That's good.
Can everyone see the full screen that I'm sharing?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Right. So let's just we'll head through this presentation. As I said, looking at the environmental and status and heritage status quo. From a locality perspective, I think everyone is very familiar with where we're at and the boundaries of the Greater Lanseria Master Plan area. Uki's gone through that in quite a lot of detail now. Okay, so I was just having a look regarding the locality of where we're looking at, but I think everyone is quite familiar with the area as Uki's outlined, with Lanseria Airport being obviously the point. What we did in this particular is just to look at all the environmental factors and heritage factors which make up this area, and also then driving that towards a proposed development areas from an environmental constraints and opportunities perspective. Okay, looking at areas that obviously have environmental constraints, and from a development perspective, where in those areas we could have certain types of development. Looking at just the status of the Greater Lanseria Master Plan area, we took a number of things into consideration. Obviously, we looked at the Gauteng Conservation Plan, which has got a lot of data in terms of critical biodiversity areas and ecological support areas. Anyway, I was saying that with regards to the environmental status of the area, we looked at a number of different things. The Gauteng Conservation Plan was one of them, looking at the critical biodiversity areas and ecological support areas. The climate of the area, the topography and ridges, it's quite a hilly area with lots of river systems, which means it's quite diverse. We looked at the fauna, flora, and habitat, and we'll get onto that a little bit later. Hydrological and wetland aspects. The hydrological and wetland aspect that we looked at focused very much on what the available data was. There has been a separate wetland and watercourse study that's been undertaken by Index Consulting, which I'll touch on, but it's basically to say that obviously wetlands and rivers and dams and all of those and all watercourses have been taken into consideration and used in the development of this greater master plan and the development potential of the area. Important bird areas. Most of the site north of the entire site north of the N14 is part of the Magaliesberg important birding area. Looking also at the agricultural potential based primarily on what data is available from the Gauteng Conservation Plan. And once again, there has actually been a separate agricultural potential study that's been done as part of this program, this process. So I'm not going to go on about the agricultural potential, as that sort of forms a separate study. Mines and quarries. There are quite a few mines or open cast quarries and sand mining and what have you in the Greater Lanseria area. We looked at that also from a buffer perspective. And then obviously heritage and archaeological aspects, because we cannot disregard the cradle of humankind. It's part of the study area, and that is obviously the single biggest heritage feature in the study area. If you could go to the next slide, please, Naomi. With regards to the legislation we considered, as I say, I don't want to go into a lot of detail on each of these pieces of legislation because it can be quite involved in detail, and our reports do elaborate quite a lot on each of these. But obviously, the first one being the South African Constitution, which is obviously the bedrock of a lot of legislation and environmental legislation in the country. The National Environmental Management Act, the National Water Act, National Heritage Resources Act, then 3 of the NEMA Acts, which are the Biodiversity Act, the Air Quality Act, and the Protected Areas Act. All of those pieces of legislation have been used and assessed in looking at what is in the Greater Lanseria area, in the master plan area, and how they all affect the development potential of that area. We can shift to the next slide, please. One of the biggest things considered, obviously, with regards to getting towards the development framework from an environmental perspective was the policies and regulations considered. There are a number of policies and regulations. Berkey has touched on that in his presentation, and again, I'm not going to go into detail, but there were a lot of, like the Lanseria Regional Spatial Development Policy, which was something which has already been done. There was a Lanseria Integrated Open Space Plan, which was for a much smaller area of the master plan area, but quite a lot of quite detailed work had already been done in that open space plan. There's obviously the Cradle of Humankind Integrated Management Plan, very specific document relating specifically to the management of the Cradle of Humankind area. And obviously we don't want to rewrite those type of policies and management plans, and that is something that is specific to the Cradle of Humankind area, and something which we obviously have to take into consideration, and from a development perspective, we have to take into consideration for any development in that area. The map, the top map indicates sort of the conservation and protected areas, as well as the Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site. The Northern Farms / Deep Slope Nature Reserve, as it's also referred to, is sort of just to the east of Lanseria Airport. Then another protected area is the Renoster Strait Conservancy, which is now called the Crocodile River Reserve. That forms quite a large chunk of the northern part of the study area. And then obviously there's the Cradle World Heritage Site, which forms a huge part of the western boundary, and obviously is inside the Greater Lanseria master area, as can be seen by the light yellow boundary. And then the big green area in the middle of that light yellow is actually what's referred to as the Nash Nature Reserve, which forms a fairly sort of core area of the Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site. Then other policies or development spatial plans which have been taken into consideration in the development of this is obviously the Tshwane Region 4 Biodiversity Plan, the City of Joburg Regional Spatial Development Framework. I see one that's missing there, apologies, and that's the Kali City SDF, which has also been had a look at. Then something which is fairly new, and it's a great development tool in Gauteng at the moment, an environmental assessment tool is the Environmental Management Framework. A snapshot of that framework is indicated in the lower map on the slide, where the vast green area to the north is considered to be sensitive, to the north and west, whereas the majority of the yellow area in the south and southeast is urban development area. So you can see this is an incredibly diverse piece of land from an environmental perspective, and from environmental perspective, picked up as part of the Gauteng Environmental Management Framework that was done 6 years ago now, and is currently in the process of being updated and revised, in fact. Regulations, the environmental impact assessment regulations were looked at and touched on. Of course, what we've done in this instance is not an environmental impact assessment. It is a status quo analysis of the broad area. And those regulations were looked at and considered in any development application that might happen or start on various portions of land or in precincts within the Lanseria, Greater Lanseria area. Two of the policies, one of the GDOT Ridges policy with regards to rocky ridges was taken into consideration, and then the GDOT pollution buffer guideline was also taken into consideration, specifically regarding pollution buffers around wastewater treatment works and mines and quarries, and those type of things. And all of those things have obviously also been mapped into into one sort of integrated map that talks to areas which are considered preferable or not preferable for development. Okay, if you can shoot to the next slide, please, Naomi. As part of our study, we undertook 2 desktop assessments. The area is 54,000 hectares in extent, and doing anything on a very detailed level from an environmental perspective would take a very, very long time, as you can imagine. And then for an environmental impact assessment, for example, all areas of the site need to be properly ground truth, even though sort of 50% of the area is already urban and built up. It just wasn't feasible to undertake on-site, full-on on-site assessments of the entire Greater Lanseria area. So the 2 desktop studies that were undertaken as part of the status quo assessment was a formal assessment and a heritage assessment. Both of those based on available data, available spatial data, and available data from existing smaller impact assessments that have been done within the Greater Lanseria area. I touched on it just now, and the map shown here is the present ecological state of wetlands and watercourses within the Greater Lanseria Master Plan area. A wetland study has been done separately, and I'm not going to get into a huge amount of detail in this presentation on it, but all wetlands, rivers, dams have already been identified within the study area and mapped, and the present ecological state has been determined by Index Consulting. Dr. Andries Koos has been involved with that, and it obviously forms a huge part of forming the development plan in terms of no-go areas for ecologically sensitive areas. All wetlands and watercourses and rivers and what have you are considered to be sensitive and have been excluded from the overall planning of hard development areas, let's say that, okay? But at the same time, we have to know where those wetlands and rivers are so that there can be proper environmental planning done from a stormwater perspective, from a roads perspective, and from a wastewater storage perspective, those type of things. Obviously, that's quite a critical component to know where all of these lie within the study area. Another study that's done separately is agricultural potential assessment, which has also been done by Index Consulting and others on the project team, and has specifically looked at the agricultural potential of various areas within the Greater Lanseria Master Plan. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail there. Our reporting and status quo is very much based on the information that they have provided to us. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the desktop studies undertaken, we'll start with heritage, the heritage aspects. Obviously, the biggest heritage aspect of the Greater Lanseria Master Plan is obviously the Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site. That's shown on the map on the slide by the lighter yellow area, which, as you can see, takes up a strip on the western side of the master plan, and then extends far up towards the west. Other sites that have been considered, so from a heritage perspective, let's just look at the Cradle of Humankind. Obviously, there's lots of other aspects too. There's Stone Age, Iron Age, and Historical Age sites which are all within and around the Greater Lanseria Master Plan area. Now, obviously, as I've said, this was a desktop study and no ground truthing has been done, but there is a lot of available data from the South African Heritage Resources Agency and other bits of data specifically from archaeological digs or heritage assessments that have been done in the area that then will show on this particular map where those particular historical sites or Iron Age sites or cemeteries are. Those are areas which have been identified on a broad level, but would have to obviously be looked at in a lot more detail in a site-specific environmental impact assessment. But we looked at the entire area and have just identified various heritage sites, and obviously identified the fact that anything that falls within the Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site is also managed by its own integrated management plan. And any form of development would also need to take into cognizance that that management plan. And obviously any development within the Lanseria master plan area would need to take cognizance of the heritage and archaeological features on a site-specific basis as well. We can shoot to the next slide, please. The second desktop study that was done was obviously the formal sensitivity or a formal assessment. This was based on work that the formal consultant had done in this greater area, as well as available spatial data. A very broad sensitivity plan was drawn up and mapped in terms of the high sensitivity areas, the medium high sensitive areas, the medium sensitive areas, and then all the white in between is low sensitivity or already built up areas. Okay, so that basically also just gave us a little bit of an idea of taking away from what's actually mapped in terms of the Gauteng Conservation Plan or the Gauteng Environmental Management Framework, what is actually happening on the ground from a desktop perspective based on previous studies in the area, and that is sort of where we got to. And as you can obviously see, the north and western parts of the study area remain the highest sensitivity areas, whereas the central and southern and southeastern areas are definitely of a far lower sensitivity from a faunal perspective, basically because of the urbanization that's happened in those areas. Okay, then, the next slide, please, Nomi. So I'm gonna talk to this slide for a little bit longer, and then essentially with all the data that we looked at, considering the wetland and their buffers, considering the environmental management plan, or the Gauteng Environmental Management Framework rather, the Gauteng Conservation Plan, the faunal desktop assessment, the Cradle of Humankind, everything sort of packaged into one, we have produced a conceptual environmental development plan. Now, when we talk of development, lots of people think that development is putting in hard concrete surfaces everywhere, high-rise buildings or residential development and what have you. In this particular instance, we also specifically had to look at development in the context of recreational, conservation, and tourism development. Okay, so one can't just blanket out an area and say we cannot develop anything there. So, for example, from an environmental perspective, you've got in the northern areas, which is the green, and the western areas, which is the green. That's the Cradle of Humankind on the west, and then the Crocodile River Reserve on the north. Those areas are best suited from an environmental perspective to recreation, conservation, and tourism related development. So small scale lodges or adventure activities, hiking activities, and this is also where the whole tourism related theme comes in, which I think Urki will expand on too. But where the tourism related theme of adventure tourism or ecotourism, lots of people in this day and age have moved away from just going on a weekend break to sit at a hotel. They have moved towards adventure activities and outdoor activities which encompass and incorporate some environmental features. As an example, Mogalisberg zip lines, where people want to be engaged with the environment on a thrill-seeking adventure sort of tourism experience. Okay, so those type of areas would be best suited to that type of development. Certainly not suited to hard brick and mortar type development. Okay, that would be focused on areas of the master plan. So if we move slightly sort of away from that, you've got the purple area in the middle, which would be agricultural related development. So if you touched on it earlier, that would be some sort of agricultural hub. So when we talk of development, again, I'm emphasizing, let's not think brick and mortar all the time. Development can be a number of different aspects, and that area would be best suited from an environmental and protected areas, because the Deep Skirt Nature Reserve or Northern Farms is a protected area. It would be best suited then to an agricultural related development or agricultural hub of some description. Moving further sort of south and along the N14, you can see a lot of the N14 highway, which is the red line that sort of cuts diagonally through the area. That area and all the yellow is development with limited constraints. So from an environmental perspective, those are areas that have limited environmental constraints for development. Obviously, you might get some very small site-specific problems, a small rock or a wetland which may not have been identified specifically here, or a heritage site or a cemetery or something like that. But I'm talking broad scale. I'm talking sort of a little bit more high level. Those are areas which are best suited for development with limited constraints. And then the orange and darker green areas on this map are other areas where the development with major constraints and development with some constraints. So that means that there are other sensitivities which have been mapped in those orange areas or in those darker green areas, which could be ridges, for example, or something like that, which would limit the absolute development, sort of brick and mortar development in those areas, and we have to be far more sensitive developments in those areas. So this map gives a sort of an indication of what we're looking at in terms of environmental constraints for development of the Greater Lanseria area. So that's that map, and if we can maybe just move to the final, the second last slide, please, Naomi. So essentially, what we've done with this phase is we've just looked at all the environmental considerations as have been sort of packaged into something as per that last slide with that map. So going forward, sorry, it's not showing up the next slide on my side. Maybe I'm not sure if it's. Here we go. Okay, it's not on my side. Thanks. So going forward from an environmental considerations perspective, obviously there are areas that need ground treatment. Number one, going to the sites, going to the precincts, going to have a look at exactly what is absolutely on the ground. So then site-specific or precinct-specific EIAs, but not EIA environmental impact assessments. I include water use licensing in that too. But then also considering not just looking at the site or precinct specific, but looking how that is integrated to a bigger Greater Lanseria master plan picture, and not just looking at it as a single site. Okay. The third point is obviously to plan using environmentally sustainable urban planning factors. Okay, it's very important in this day and age looking at sort of smart cities, sustainable cities as Lanseria is going to be. One has to look at urban transport systems that need to be more sustainable, non-motorized transport, and also the integration of open spaces. How can open spaces be used for multi-purposes? So not just open space that's park. It can be used for various other aspects, such as stormwater management and transport. So pedestrian walkways or cycleways, those type of things. Nature-based solutions. So looking at SUDs, sustainable urban drainage systems, and green infrastructure within those areas. Climate resilience of the cities is vitally important these days. Looking at urban gardens and also the protection from weather extremes. How does one plan a city from an environmental perspective? to look at weather extremes. On the Highveld, particularly stronger thunderstorms that we've been experiencing in the last few years. Energy efficiency, a huge thing. Electricity is under huge pressure in the country. How does one look at greener energy solutions? Green building design to allow for a more sustainable development in terms of energy efficiency of the building. Waste to energy. What can waste be used to create energy? Those are all these type of things that have to be integrated and considered in going forward with this type of city planning or precinct planning too. Integrated spatial and environmental planning. So obviously that's looking at open spaces or usable, functional, and active areas. Okay. It also links back to the green infrastructure and the sustainable urban drainage, stormwater management. How those green open spaces can be functional and active areas. People can go running there and cycling there at the same time as they are areas which are for stormwater management and provide that green lung to the city. Waste and effluent management is a huge thing. Becky touched on it. Package plants or other smaller wastewater treatment plants. The splitting of grey water and black water, for example, and the use of that grey water. How can it be used in the urban framework? And then evaluate and incorporate the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals are obviously a very high level number of things presented by the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals, and how those can be incorporated into the master plan development process and used to inform various environmental aspects of a big city such as Lanseria going forward. And I think now that we've sort of got the status quo and we've looked at where there are development areas or constraints within that Lanseria area, the next phase would look at all of these considerations in a more detailed manner and how these can all integrate to form the proper sustainable city that we're looking at for Lanseria. So that's pretty much my presentation. There is only one more slide, but it's a thank you slide, and I think I'll hand back to Nomi. Thank you, and then I can take questions on all of that. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian, and apologies